Welcome back to Easily Explained, where today we will be talking about the second part of indirect object pronouns in Spanish. So let's get started. In the last video, we taught you how to identify indirect objects in Spanish. So make sure to go rewatch part 1 so that everything in part 2 is easy and makes sense. Also, if you need more help with indirect objects and identifying them, be sure to check out our very first video on indirect objects, which are indirect objects in English. But today we will be talking about indirect object pronouns, all of them, and how to use them and their separate rules. But first, let's do a quick recap of how to identify an indirect object pronoun. If we are talking about an example in English, like Maria gives the book to her, indirect object answers the question to whom or for whom. So when we look at the verb gives, subject is Maria and the direct object is the book. So Maria gives the book to who or for whom? To her. So her is the indirect object in this case. Let's do one example in Spanish and then we'll get on to the pronouns and how to replace them in each sentence. So in Spanish, we would say María da el libro a ella. Maria gives the book to her. And in the same way, we have to identify the verb da. Subject is still Maria. El libro is the direct object. Maria gives the book to whom? To ella, to her. So ella is the indirect object. Now when we start talking about indirect object pronouns, there it's going to replace this phrase a ella. So you don't have to say to somebody every single time. A ella, a él, a usted. Indirect object pronouns are made so that we don't need these. So by now you should be fairly familiar with this chart. We use it for almost every conjugation and any sort of grammar concept in Spanish. So as a reminder, your subject pronouns are yo, tú, él, ella, usted, nosotros, vosotros, ellos, ellas, ustedes. And these are your IOPs that are different for each subject pronoun. Also, if you'll remember that your DOP chart looked very, very similar to this, there's only two changes, and that is in the el, ella, usted form and the ellos, ellas, ustedes form. But we'll get to that. So it's IOPs, indirect object pronouns, me, te, le, nos, os, les. So if we ever wanted to, also I want to make one thing clear, is that the indirect object must match with the subject pronoun. It's not the subject itself. So for example, if we took the sentence we were working with, María da el libro a ella, and we identified that a ella is the indirect object pronoun, we are going to use the ella form here. We are not going to look at the subject, even though in this case it worked out. But for example, if this was nosotros or nosotras damos, we wouldn't use nos, we would use le still because the indirect object is referring to ella. So we're not talking about the subject. Who is being indirectly affected? That's the indirect pronoun we're going to use. So if I'm the one indirectly getting affected, I'm going to use me. Same with the rest of them, and so on. And our DOP chart was top half similar. It was still me, te, nos, os, but it was different for el, ella, usted, and the plural ellos, ellas, ustedes, and that was based on masculine or feminine. If it was el, it was lo, and if it was plural masculine, it was los, and la and las. But in IOPs, it doesn't matter about the gender. We just have one and only option, le and les. So now back to our example. Ella is our indirect object, and we are now going to replace it with the correct indirect object pronoun, which we already identified as le, because it's the ella form and ella usted form. But now it's just a matter of where we're placing it. And indirect object pronouns and direct object pronouns have this in common. So also make sure to go check out the direct object pronouns part 2 video where we explain that again. But if you'll recall from that video, indirect object pronouns and direct object pronouns, when there is only one verb, like there is in this case, the verb da, which comes from dar, to give, we put the indirect object pronoun or the direct object pronoun, if we're talking about that, before the conjugated verb. So we can tell this one's conjugated, so we know it's going to go before that. So the entire sentence will look like Maria le da el libro. And also we explained in direct object pronouns, part 2, that you don't re-add that part in, because the whole part of indirect object pronouns and direct object pronouns is to be able to get rid of that and make it a little bit shorter, a little bit easier to converse casually. So we're not going to add that in again. And just like in DOPs, there are different cases. When we talk about two verbs, it's going to be basically the same idea as when it was what it was in direct object pronouns, but let's go over that again. For example, if we added another verb to the example that we keep going back to, and we put the verb va from ir, which means to go. So now it became Maria is going to give the book to her. Now we still have the indirect object, so we still need the indirect object pronoun. But since there's two verbs, we now have two options on how to include our IOP. Our first option is to use that same rule and say that the indirect object pronoun just has to be before the conjugated verb. And as we can tell, the second verb is always in infinitive form. Because if we were to write that in English, Maria is going to give. We don't say Maria gives. We don't say that. That to give is still an infinitive when we say it. In English, we don't usually recognize that because we don't have separate conjugation charts in English. But in Spanish, we have to be very careful that we don't conjugate it and we leave it in infinitive form. So if the indirect object pronoun goes before the conjugated verb, it will read Maria le va a dar el libro. And we still don't include a ella. So we have the IOP correct. It aligns with ella. And the second verb is still conjugated. And we still have the direct object. And also it is possible to have both an indirect object and a direct object in the exact same sentence. So make sure to keep that in mind. But the second option is to attach the indirect object pronoun to the infinitive in the same way that we attach direct object pronouns to the infinitive as an option when there's two verbs. So we're going to leave the first part of the sentence alone. Maria va, still make sure you conjugate the first verb and not the second one. Va a dar, but we're just going to add the infinitive to it. So it becomes one word. Maria va a darle el libro. Also, now that I have mentioned when a direct object pronoun and an indirect object pronoun are together in the same sentence. Just wanted to clarify that indirect object pronouns are still going to go before the direct object pronoun. So it's going to be indirect object pronoun, direct object pronoun, and then your verb. And if there was a subject, then the subject would come before the indirect object pronoun itself. But we're not going to go too into that. We are just going to focus right now specifically on indirect object pronouns. Now for practice, rewrite the sentences with the correct IOP. Make sure that your pronoun is correct and it matches with the indirect object, but also make sure that you place it right according to whether it has one verb, one option, or two verbs, two options. All right. Number 1. Yo escribo una carta para ellas means I write a letter for them. Our verb is escribo, and it's the one and only verb in this sentence, which means that we only have one option, placing the indirect object pronoun before escribo. So, yo is our subject, escribo is our verb, una carta is your direct object, and ellas is your indirect object. Because if you were to ask the question, I read the letter to whom? To them, to ellas, para ellas, for ellas. So ellas is our indirect object pronoun, and if we think back to our IOP chart, me, te, le, nos, os, les. So our correct object pronoun is les. So yo les escribo una carta. And we take out para ellas. We don't repeat that. And also, if we were to just start the sentence from les escribo una carta, that would still work if we take out this. Because the conjugated form of escribir already tells us that I'm talking about myself, that I wrote. So be careful because that's not something you can do in English, but since we have different conjugations in Spanish, you can do that in Spanish. Number 2. Nosotros queremos dar un regalo a Carolina. So this one does have two verbs. We have queremos, which means to want, or in this conjugated form, it means we want. And then dar, to give, in infinitive form. Nosotros is our subject. Un regalo is direct object, and Carolina is the indirect object. We want to give a gift to whom? To Carolina. And this is ella. So métele. Le is our correct one. And since we have two verbs, we have two options. Number 1, nosotros le queremos dar un, or we can attach the infinitive, we can attach the IOP to the infinitive itself and say nosotros queremos darle. All right. Number 3. Tú vas a hablar a él. So again, we have two different verbs. We have vas from ir and hablar not conjugated. Tú is our subject, vas and hablar are our verbs, and él is our indirect object. So in this case, we actually don't have any direct object. So that is something to note, is that even though a lot of the sentences do have direct objects, some with indirect objects don't have direct objects. So we want to clarify that yes, there are a few rare times when that can happen. But we know that for él, it's still le. So we're going to say, ¿tú le vas a hablar? Or we can say, ¿tú vas a hablarle? And attach it to the infinitive. And the last one, yo tengo una pregunta para ella. So we just have one verb. Tengo means to have. Yo is the subject. I'm the subject. Una pregunta is our direct object. And ella is the indirect object. So again, yo le tengo una pregunta. And since there's only one verb, this is our only correct option. Congratulations! You are now an expert at indirect object pronouns in Spanish. We hope this video really helped, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye!